the engine is on the hoist and ready to drop in. There's a few things I like to put on before the engine goes in: crank pulley, oil filter adapter, manifolds or headers, motor mounts, and flex plate. And in this video, I'll show you how I install all that. Got the exhaust manifolds. If you're gonna do headers, I like to do the exhaust manifolds and all this stuff at the same time, just to make sure everything fits correctly, including the dipstick tube. And this car is not going to get it put back on, but your EGR tube would also go on right now before the engine goes back in. So one of the studs came out with the manifold. There was a few of them that did. I'm going to spray these with PB Blaster. So on the end of the stud is hex. It's a 5 mil. So we'll put a 13 open in and a 5 mil in here. And now we can put the stud back in. If you're not using locking header bolts or locking exhaust manifold bolts, I would use the stud. So as many studs as you can. So some tubular headers you won't be able to use studs on all of them, but I would use as many as you can. Now I'm going to use Felpro exhaust manifold gaskets. Before you put your exhaust manifold on, you want to make sure your gasket surface is clean. So the book says to torque these to 20 foot-pounds. That seems a little low to me. If you want to put a little extra on there, then I'd probably put a little more on there than that. The motor mount can go on. The stud, the one with the stud sticking out, goes on the bottom front. So sometimes I've seen it where the motor mount will hit this little block of aluminum here. You either have to clearance the motor mount or the block itself. So you don't want to over tighten these because it's an aluminum block. It could strip it out of the block. I do probably about 30 to 40 foot-pounds on those. Now on this side we can put our studs back in. Now the gasket. Again, make sure the gasket surface on the exhaust manifold is clean. Before going further, I'm going to put the dipstick tube in because it goes between the manifold and between the motor mount. Put a little bit of oil on the O-ring to help it slide in. And I can put the dipstick back in. Exhaust manifold can go on. And if you're going to run an EGR, then now would be a good time to put the tube on. We're not going to run that, so we can put this little cap on there. Now we can put this side motor mount. The studs go on the front too. Here's the oil filter adapter. I cleaned it up and blew it out with compressed air. When you do clean these up, you want to take out any of the plugs or the oil sending unit and then get down in there. Some of these are really gummed up. But when you look at these, like this one, you can see it's got a lot of pitting all around there from the coolant. So they don't make these anymore. You could probably have these machined down. I tried sanding this down a little bit with like some 400 grit sandpaper, but it ain't gonna take these pits out. There's two different gaskets. There's one for with an oil cooler, like with the Cobra engines, and there's one for without it. One will have a smaller hole right here, and one will have a larger hole. This one looks like it's the smaller hole, so I'm going to use the small one. You can see that it lines up perfect. It's also a good idea to make sure it lines up with the block perfect. Now this feels like it's not going to fit on there, so the actual rubber part of it is hanging out inside the block. So here's the bigger one, and that's going to be perfect. Now with our bigger gasket, you can see that it'll still work on this oil filter adapter. And you can see the difference. See how the one is much smaller. So I don't like to do this, but just to make sure that we don't get any leaks around this, I'm going to put a thin layer of RTV around the coolant part. You want to inspect your block too. They can corrode around in the same area. This one's really good, but you can have the same issue here. Now I put the oil filter adapter. I'm not sure why this sensor is hitting the block here, but I'm going to take it out. You also don't want to over tighten these. I believe the book calls for 90 inch-pounds. These you can strip the block out as well. What I'll do is I'll get like just a little T-fitting or a 90-degree and put in here for the oil sensor. Also going to put the crank pulley on. I'm going to do it on the stand because I use the stand to hold the crank when I do it, especially since it's an automatic car. I can't just put it in gear. So to get the crank ready, one, you want to make sure that you don't have cracks in the rubber or anything like that. You need to clean out the RTV that's in the keyway. I just use a little screwdriver. This is the factory crank bolt. It is torque to yield. Shouldn't be reused. I know some people do reuse them. They just torque them to like 100 or 120 or something like that, but they're not supposed to be reused. So we got this ARP crank bolt. It's 1562501. This one is reusable. It comes with a new washer. To put these pulleys in, I have a longer bolt because the factory bolt isn't going to be long enough to grab any of the threads and pull the pulley on there. So I use a longer bolt of the same thread pitch with a thinner washer. So that keyway, we're going to put some RTV down inside there. I pretty much just fill the whole keyway up. Now using a longer bolt, get started. You want to be careful with this longer bolt because you don't want it to bottom out inside the crank. You could actually break the crank. So you only need to get a few turns. Now double check and make sure we get some thread engagement with the ARP one. And that's not very much. So I'm going to put the thin washer on there and suck the pulley in a little bit more. I got ARP lube on the threads and underneath the head of the bolt. Okay, now the motor's starting to turn over. We need to stop it from turning over. So the way I do it is I put two flywheel or Flexplate bolts in there, and then I'm going to put a crowbar in between them, and as it rotates, the crowbar is going to end up stopping right on one of these bars that's holding it on there, and then I'll be able to torque the crank bolt. I'm going to swap it out with flywheel bolts. You can see the flywheel bolts are longer than the Flexplate bolts. Now with that wedged in there, I can continue to turn the crank. You want to do it slow so you don't suck in the tape. Yeah, right there. Now it's wedged in between the two. And the crank pulley bolt is torqued to 100 foot-pounds. So now we can get to the rear seal, the rear crank cover. This doesn't have the seal in it. I've already cleaned this up. You want to clean any of the RTV, old RTV off of it. Make sure it's nice and smooth on the bottom as well, because you can put new RTV down here. This is the Felpro gasket BS 40620. This is the one that doesn't come with this little installation tool. Unless you have an extra one of these lying around like I do, this one's a little bit cheaper, but you can also buy this seal with the tool. When it says comes with the tool, this is the tool that it comes with, just a little piece of plastic. But this makes it way easier to put that on. You want this. Okay, so here's our seal. There's our lip, the spring. The lip is going to go towards the oil. I use a piece of wood. It's in there nice and flush. And now the tool, it's got a wide end and a narrower end. You're going to put the narrow end inside there. Basically what that does, it helps get the lip over the crank. So you just slide that in. So that sticks out. Alright, I just attached the engine to the hoist. I had to find some bigger bolts for the back here because these are M12s. It got good thread engagement, so it goes in most of the way through the block. But you don't want to go too long with these because when you go to take them out, they'll hit the firewall. And on the front, I'm lifting from the alternator support area. Now we can get it up in the air and get the engine stand off it. Now we're going to put the plug to the oil gallery in. And I like to put just a thin little coat of RTV around the side of it, and then I'm going to use a socket and just hammer it in. You want to go, when you hammer it in, you want to go just a little bit beyond flush and nice and even. Before we put our main seal on here, we want to make sure everything's clean. Make sure our oil pan bolts are loose. Just these back four. Now we take our cover and just coat RTV all along the sides of it. And you can take a dab and put it in the corners here. There's two locating dowels that it's going to go on. Here's where the tool comes in handy. What it is, it goes over the crank like that, and it allows the lip to expand over it. So you put the tool down inside here. The big end is facing up. Once it's all the way on there, you can pull your tool out. These get torqued to 90 inch-pounds. And finally we can put the two oil pan bolts up in the back. And we can tighten all of our oil pan bolts now. So before you put the spacer plate and the flex plate on, you want to make sure that there are two dowels in here. Sometimes they can stay with the trans, or sometimes they're just missing, but you need these locating dowels in the engine. Now the flex plate, or flywheel if you got it, these only line up one way. Flex plate bolts get torqued to 90 foot-pounds. When you tighten these to 90, you're probably going to need to hold the crank in the front.